Hey team, hope you're well. Today, I want to make a video explaining why I think it's not necessarily the best decision to look at buying your dream home as a first home buyer. Now, there might be some caveats to like this video, but I want to just take you through a scenario I've had with two clients where they're in great financial positions, they're earning really good money, they're looking at buying their first home, sort of above that $1 million price range. And I'm going to take you through the scenarios and actually what transpired with this story. And I'm going to give you my thoughts on it and what I also recommended for the clients in their scenario. Okay, so basically, there were occasions for both of these clients I was helping where we had done a lot of due diligence for the properties they were looking at partaking in an auction. So we got them in a position where they were going to make an unconditional offer at auction, right? Now, my first client, this was the scenario of the property they were looking at buying. So we got a registered valuation done on the property. It came back at $1,330,000. And bank valuation was sitting around $1,200,000. If you're wondering, what this sort of means, there's a video I've made explaining how properties are valued in New Zealand. That might be a good video to watch if you're curious. But this is a really key data point to just suggest how much the property is actually worth right now from the bank's point of view, especially. Okay, so this is one client scenario. Now the other client scenario did a similar thing. They were looking at partaking in auction, and these were the numbers. Okay, now I think this property was maybe in Central Auckland, let's say. This one was in the North Shore, okay? Now, for these clients, if they're first home buyers, they have a little bit less than 20% deposit. But, these are homes that they would probably see themselves in for, 5, 10, 15 years plus. They probably don't need to upgrade necessarily, but this is like probably quote unquote their dream home in regards to what they're after right now, Now, for this client, what actually ended up happening is, I said to them, look, with where things sit, if you're going to have less than a 20% deposit, I definitely wouldn't recommend bidding over the registered valuation. Where we are in with the property cycle, how much, your debt obligations will be relative to what you would get if you were to rent it out is going to be super significant. You're going to have to top up a lot, and you also will be on a low equity margin for an extended period of time if you go over the valuation. Plus, you'll have to contribute more into the deal in terms of cash input because the bank is going to lend on the lower of the two of these. So say if they look to buy for 1.4 million, but the property is only worth 1.33, the bank is going to be very exposed in that scenario if they're only going to input, say, 150K, maybe their loan is 1.25 mil, but they're going to lend on this value, the lower of the two, 1.33, rather than what they're buying for. So effectively, there's only 80 grand in there, and that's going to be probably too exposed for a lender to care. So, or not necessarily care, but for them to release the funds, they're going to be too exposed probably in that regard from their point of view. So I said to them, look, I don't think it would be what I recommend to go over the registered valuation. That's what the property's valued at, where we are in the market. I wouldn't look to do anything more. Now, this property, I was watching the auction live, and it ended up going up to 1.4 million. And I was thinking, okay, like it is in a nice area, in the sense that like it's quite close to the water and these things, but it's not in that much of a glamorous area, right? Like we literally had a registered valuation completed on it maybe like 2 or 3 days before the auction what was going. And after I saw that, I was like, wow, someone really, really wants this property. But what actually ended up happening is this property sold for $1,540,000 when it got taken to the box room at the auction, right? And I was just thinking like, how on earth does this make financial sense? Not only it was like gutted for my client because they, spent so much time getting their ducks in a row to be in a position to partake of the auction, but like we've literally had a registered valuation done on it, and it's gone for probably like 15% over the registered valuation in this market. That being said, I guess, there's, we're not necessarily creating any additional land, and it's in, a desirable location to at least two people that were, putting up the bidding, so to speak. But I'm going to take through the numbers of why I think this is just like, doesn't make financial sense from my point of view. Maybe there is, something going on in regards to like, maybe they're selling a property and they really need to buy, and they need an urgent solution and want that security, and they don't really care. But to me, financially, this is pretty irresponsible from my point of view, like going so much over. I'll go a bit more into detail on it later. But another one here as well is this property, right? So another client of mine looking at buying in Central Auckland, $1,100,000 was the valuation. It ended up selling for $1,240,000. So pretty similar, like maybe going 15% above the registered valuation. Clients were a little bit gutted, but again, like, this is just something that's happened recently. Maybe this is something that was happening quite recurringly at the peak of the market when, properties were selling for more than what they were being valued at. But again, to me, like, this just doesn't necessarily make, it's not, from my point of view, very financially responsible to bid so much more over than what the property is actually deemed to be worth from the bank's point of view. So what this also means as well is that, say in the event, in most cases, if they're going to look at moving banks, maybe trying to seek a better solution, they're going to look at these valuations most likely. Maybe because of the recent sale, maybe the valuation might be close to that. But the bank is going to think to themselves, look, if we give a solution to pay out your existing debt with whatever bank you arrange this through, they're going to think they're going to be probably pretty exposed. And the other thing to consider too is the cash flow commitments for this. So for example, for my clients, if they were going to buy this property for the first example, and maybe their debt obligations might have been, let's say, I think maybe 1.1 million is maybe what their debt would have been if they were buying at the registered valuation price, okay? Now, they probably would have had interest rates around 4.99. They might have had a small margin added to their rate, so we'll use that in this scenario. Now, just from their debt commitments every single week in this regard, they're looking at weekly repayments of 1,360 per week alone, okay? Maybe if they have, more than a 20% deposit, they might have a little bit of a slightly lower rate, but still pretty high, especially relative to what this property would probably rent out for if it was going to be rented out, which we will cover shortly. Now, if I go to actually that scenario now, let's input this detail a little bit further. So say the purchase price, let's say is 1.33 million, as that's the registered valuation in the first example we went through. Legal costs and valuation is probably going to be $3,500. Okay, no renovations required because it's a beautiful property. Maybe there's maintenance ongoingly, but there's no upfront cost necessarily needed in this purchase. I think the cash deposit, I think the clients had about 160 grand available. So the expected loan amount for this property would be roughly this. I think it's actually higher than what I had in my example before here. 1,366 per week. Plus, they would probably have likely have a higher rate to probably around 4.99, maybe even higher, to be honest. So let's input that data here. 4.99 principal and interest. So that's a weekly mortgage repayment for these guys. Now, in the event that, say, something happens with their situation, maybe if they want to move and don't necessarily want to sell and rent this property out, we can look at that aspect as well. Initially, let's look at it without it, okay? Just to go through this purchase, because this would have been their scenario if they were buying it for 1.33, okay? So no weekly rental income, no accountant required to do the books for that one because it's an owner-occupied or personal property. Insurance and rate obligations, I'm going to say, are probably actually around $3,000 per year on this property. I would say probably 0.5% of the purchase price is going to be towards repairs and maintenance, so $6,000 per year. Maybe actually I'll do a little bit less just so I'm not inflating the numbers so much. Let's do 0.3% of the purchase price or $4,000 per year. No property manager. So every single year, the cost to hold this property are going to be, I think, $84,000 per year. Total annual cost, including interest. Annual interest costs. It's probably one of the two numbers, okay? Let's actually just use the $75,000 figure, right? So basically, they're buying for 133. And to justify this further, from an investment point of view, it's going to cost them $75,000 just to hold, okay? Now, to get a return on that fund year on year, they might anticipate they might get 4, 5, 6% year on year growth from buying this property, right? So 5% of the purchase price they're buying for would be that their property is going to gain value of $66,500. But just to pay off, a small portion of the principal in the early stages of having this home loan, we're looking at $75,000 per year. And this figure as well, the 5% growth, is speculative. Like in the last couple of years, we haven't seen like any growth whatsoever. It's actually been the opposite. It's probably going down 5% year on year. So to me, when I look at the scenario of like owning this home, like sure, this could be, really great over the long term in the sense that, this area becomes more and more desirable. Maybe there's more than 5% growth year on year that's achieved, but it's quite speculative in the sense that like this might be a really good decision to buy at this price. The clients I have, and our judgment for this auction is that we didn't want to go over $1.3 million. That was sort of the max price that would be justified in the scenario, you know, where the registered valuation sat and everything for them moving forward. If they wanted to refinance at 20% equity and all this stuff, we thought that was pretty fair buying and reasonable, you know, made a lot of sense. But the fact that this actually went for $1,540,000, when I run the scenario, it just makes me like very, very surprised, you know, like obviously for these people, they must have more than 20%. Otherwise it's just complete suicide. Like I can't see a way in which any lender would do that with less than 20% where the valuations come back so low relative to what they're buying for. So they probably have maybe sold a property or are sitting on a lot of cash to do this. But even so, when I run the numbers on this relative to where all the data came back at, I just don't really comprehend how this is done. And I think a lot of people, they really won't go into that much detail and context like I am in this scenario, right? And for some people, you know, over the long term, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, maybe this turns out to be a really good investment. And maybe there's that, you know, average annualized return of more than, you know, 6% per year, which, you know, over the long term is probably going to yield a pretty good outcome. But it's very speculative. You know, we don't necessarily know or have a certainty that that is actually going to happen. And say as well, in the scenario where if you like rent this property, say I reckon it would probably get somewhere between like 850 to 900 per week. It's like a 3-bedroom home in the North Shore. You know, maybe like a 1940s, 1950s build that has like some view of the water, even though it's maybe like a couple blocks away from the water. Now, if I put the purchase price they were looking at buying for $1,330,000, and even if I assume like over the long term they're going to have a rate of 4.5% on interest only every single week, they are going to need to. I'll assume a property manager as well. They are going to need to top up $26,000 per year just to hold this property, right? Now, that might be all right because, you know, over the long term, if there is that 5% growth year on year, you're looking at maybe getting 60, 70, 75 grand in growth and, you know, building that equity, and that can really work. But again, it's speculative, you know, and plus because they're also buying these purchases at $1,540,000, you know, it even just extrapolates further the decision of like, is this actually going to be a good investment, you know? But I mean, each to their own. It's just like, this is something I really look at, and it makes me think like a lot of people just get so emotional with the purchase, and then when they actually are running these numbers, is it going to be a good decision, you know? Especially people in like 2021 and 2022. Obviously, this is all hindsight, but you know, the judgments and decisions that were made, I think a lot of them were not being, you know, like going through these numbers and forecasting things for the future, and if this actually makes financial sense, you know? In this scenario, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, I would personally, you know, probably just want to rent this property, right? If I can rent it for $850 per week relative to what I would get if I buy it, you know, maybe there isn't that security aspect there, so to speak. And I guess that's the premium you pay for, you know, paying only $850 per week to the debt obligations of like 1,450 plus rates, insurance. But like at the end of the day, that seems like a much more logical financial decision to do relative to what you could buy it for right now, from my point of view, at least. I mean, you know, again, each to your own in each scenario, but I just wanted to present that if you're looking at buying your home, maybe buying the dream home first isn't necessarily the most appropriate thing. You know, I think, you know, run the numbers, making sure you're enabling yourself to try get a good purchase price relative to, you know, how the bank's valuing it, what a registered valuation will be is really, really important. It does kind of suck, obviously, that my clients in both these scenarios have been having to pay quite a bit of money for due diligence, you know, maybe getting a builder's report and spending time and ordering a registered valuation, what's costs around, you know, $1,000. But, you know, it's a lot cheaper to do this due diligence and the inverse than maybe, you know, pay so much more compared to where the registered valuations are coming back, you know? Anyway, let me also know your thoughts in the comments if you've got through this video, maybe if you're experienced in property and have your own thoughts on it. But this is just a video I wanted to make today just to showcase, you know, my perspective of it. You know, I think I probably would have found this valuable when I was first getting into the industry, and that's sort of why I wanted to make it today. And I think it's an important one as well, or something to at least consider, you know? I'm not saying, you know, don't go buy a property, and maybe, you know, if the right one comes up and you really want to buy it and live in that the rest of your life, maybe it is worth paying the premium over the, you know, valuation price. But, you know, it's just something I wanted to share today because it's something I care about for my clients, you know, just making sure they're informed and know what they're getting themselves into. So anyway, that's the video for today, guys. I'll leave my details in the description like always if you want to reach out to me and have me do an analysis of your scenario, whether you're looking at buying a home or want a better solution for your lending or whatever it is. And I'll leave some videos on the screen just so you can watch another video of mine if you want to learn something. Cheers, guys.